John chapter 7. Out of the shadows. The late summer evening air had cooled just enough to make the front porch comfortable, but inside, the living room was warm with the hum of quiet conversation. 7 chairs were pulled into an uneven circle around a low oak coffee table. Steaming mugs rested on stone coasters beside open Bibles, some crisp and stiff-paged, others softened by decades of thumbprints and highlighters. Jim sat in his usual armchair near the window, 30 years of leading small groups behind him, the easy demeanor of a man who never felt the need to rush a conversation or force an answer. He let the silence settle a moment before he spoke. All right, everyone. We're in John chapter 7 tonight. Last week we watched Jesus feed the 5,000, and tonight we find him back in Jerusalem, in the middle of the Feast of Tabernacles. Before we jump in, what felt confusing or easy to skip past? Maya, 2 months a believer, still working her way through her first physical Bible, traced a finger down the column of verse numbers. I got lost around verse 37, Jim. Jesus stands up and talks about living water flowing out of people's bellies. Is that just a metaphor? Or is there something going on I'm missing because I don't know the background? That's probably the single most overlooked moment in the whole chapter, Jim said. And you're not missing it because you're new. Half the people who've read this book for 50 years walk right past it. He looked to Caleb, who taught history at the high school and liked nothing more than filling in the parts nobody explained. Caleb, set the scene. What was happening in Jerusalem that week? Caleb set down his mug. Tabernacles Sukkot was one of the 3 big pilgrim festivals. The city would be packed, people camped out in temporary shelters everywhere you looked. But the main event, every single morning of the feast, was the water ceremony. The high priest led a procession down to the pool of Siloam, filled a golden pitcher, and carried it back up to the temple with the whole crowd behind him, singing, blowing trumpets. Then he poured the water out over the altar, a prayer for rain on next year's crops, and a way of remembering the water God brought out of the rock for Moses in the wilderness. And on the last day of the feast, Jim said, the 7th day, the ceremony reaches its climax. The whole city is watching that pitcher. Every eye is on the altar. He let that sit a second. And right at that moment, the water hitting the stone, the trumpets still ringing. Jesus stands up in the middle of the crowd and shouts, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." He didn't pick that moment by accident, Maya. He stepped into the middle of their oldest ritual and told them the water, the rock, the whole ceremony. All of it had been pointing at him the entire time. Sarah, next to Maya on the couch, sat back. He hijacked their ceremony. He did, Jim said, and let it stand. Ruth, the oldest in the room and usually content to listen, spoke up from her chair by the bookshelf. I don't think hijacked is too strong. That's a bold thing to do in front of that many people. I'd want to know what gave him the nerve. Maybe he didn't need nerve, Caleb offered. Maybe when it's actually true, you don't need to work up the courage to say it. Ruth considered that and didn't answer right away, and nobody rushed to fill the space. David, who had been flipping quietly back and forth in his heavily annotated Bible, finally spoke. Jim, what about verse 27? The crowd says, "We know where this man is from. When the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from." I thought the prophecy was clear that the Messiah comes from Bethlehem. Why would they say nobody would know where he's from? Good catch, Jim said. You're right, Micah 5 points straight to Bethlehem, and some people even bring that up later in the chapter. But there was another tradition floating around at the time, alongside that one. A lot of Jewish writing from that period held that the Messiah would be born, then vanish, then reappear out of nowhere with nobody able to trace where he came from. So when this crowd looks at Jesus, they think, we know this man. We know his house, his family, his hometown. He's too familiar to be the one. So they had him boxed in either way, Sarah said. If he grew up somewhere they knew, he couldn't be the Messiah. If he'd shown up out of nowhere, that would have proven it. That's exactly the trap, Jim said. They knew his street address and thought that settled the question. They never asked where he actually came from. Tyler had been quiet most of the evening, arms crossed, chair pulled slightly back from the table the way he always sat. He was the youngest in the group by a decade, and it usually took him most of a session to say anything. Can I back up? He said, because none of that bothers me as much as the start of the chapter. His own brothers didn't believe him. That's his family, growing up in the same house, and they're basically daring him to go prove himself in Jerusalem because they think he's either a fraud or a coward. That's worse to me than some crowd in the city not recognizing him. Nobody spoke for a moment. I don't think that gets resolved, Jim said finally. Not in this chapter anyway. His own brothers watching him work miracles and still not believing. John doesn't explain that away. It's just true. James, one of those brothers, ends up leading the church in Jerusalem after the resurrection. But that's years off. In chapter 7, they're still outside. So what do we do with that? Tyler asked. Just sit with it? Some weeks, yeah, Jim said. Some weeks that's the whole assignment. Maya looked up. That actually helps. I keep thinking I'm supposed to walk out of every chapter with an answer. Not every chapter gives you one, Jim said. The crickets outside had picked up, filling the small pause in the room. Nobody moved to check the time. Let's finish it out, Jim said eventually. The temple guards get sent to arrest him and come back without him. When the Pharisees ask why, all they say is, "No one ever spoke the way this man does." Even the men sent to chain him ended up standing there listening instead. And then Nicodemus, David said, tapping his page. He speaks up in the Sanhedrin right after that. Says the law doesn't let them judge a man without giving him a hearing first. And what happens to him for saying it? Ruth asked. They ask him if he's from Galilee too, Jim said. Like that settles anything. He's the one person in that room following his own rules, and they brush him off for it. So even the guy trying to be fair gets shut down, Sarah said. That's where we'll pick it up next week, Jim said, closing his Bible with a soft fold. Chapter 8. Let's make some fresh tea.